Hello everyone, today I'm going to be taking a look at a 15th century Renaissance skirmish game from Masterstroke Games as I check out the Force of Virtue starter set. Okay, so this is Force of Virtue, a miniature skirmish game for Renaissance Italy by Masterstroke Games. I say that technically it's the 15th century, although the initial setting and focus for this has been around Italy, the internecine wars that the various states had there throughout the 15th century. Not the Italian wars at the end, although it could be used for that as well. We'll get into that in a little more detail later. This tin contains everything they currently do, although they have just finished a Kickstarter to add cavalry and siege rules. And I know they have plans to push on to do Elizabethan wars in Ireland. But you'll be able to see here how the game sets out, comes around. There are two quick reference sheets, a selection of cards. There are quite a lot of cards. This is because this is everything. So we'll get into those in more detail momentarily. We have a little velveteen bag. We have two little envelopes for the campaign, which is quite nice. They've got their own unique seal of approvals on them. We have a set of tokens, a set of dice. These are standard D6, just coloured to the appropriate virtues. So those are your 4 virtue colours. But there's also a set of special dice. Again, 4 different colours there, which is all part and parcel of the game itself. And then your decks of cards. So, like I say, this is all the decks. Unfortunately, this one's got a bit of a dent, thanks to our local post. But there are 5 nation decks: Spanish, French, Swiss, Landsknecht, and Conditori. There they are. So each of those is a faction within the game currently. There are also character decks, so Dawn of a New Age, Saints and Sinners, and a scenario deck, which is the rise of the Borgias. So we'll take a look at these after we've had a little look at the rules. But you can see here for the Borgia scenario deck, it's 1492. The Borgias make their bid for the papal throne. The Eternal City descends into chaos as rival factions clash amongst shattered Roman ruins, medieval hovels, and gilded Renaissance palaces. You use this scenario deck to lure your enemy into crumbling buildings or take advantage of burning heat or the hangovers of enemy troops. So we're going to start by taking a look at the rules themselves. Okay, so the Force of Virtue rulebook. It is spiral bound, which means it lies nice and flat on the table when you're playing. Gives the explanation there. 1492. Europe stands at the crossroads and Rome burns as a new pope is being chosen. So the game itself is a skirmish war game for 1 to 20 models set in Renaissance Rome during the rise of the Borgia. So 1 to 20. 1 is unlikely, although you can, and you'll see why. But a very small scale game. A little thank you to me. Well done, me. Small scale game that you can play out on a 2x2 board. You don't need to go bigger than that, although you can if you want. You can see here the contents overview. So the book itself is 90 pages long, 89 pages long. Okay, there you go. And it breaks down what's happening here. Now, first thing, Niccolo Machiavelli will pop in every now and again to give you hints and tips on what you should be doing. But the game itself is sort of prefixed by this section explaining the tone of the game. This is specifically written by historical enthusiasts and HEMA, so the European medieval martial arts enthusiasts. So they wanted a game that reflected the period, what was happening, and the actual styles of martial activities within there. This is not a game where you're going to run in and roll 20 dice against somebody else. It really is a game about historical recreation to a certain amount, while keeping it very quick and very strategic as well. So there's a nice overview of what's the preface of the game, and then the historical background. So you have the Eternal City here, the various areas that are being divvied up, and then the neighbouring states to Rome itself. So all of that is accompanied by fantastic Renaissance artwork. Really sets the tone for the whole game itself and what you need to play. So, ignoring the what you need for the time being, there is a tutorial that uses essentially a one-man army. There are QR codes where you can go and see how the actual rules are set up, but we'll go into that in a moment. The game itself is based around 4 virtues, and the virtues are not the religious virtues, but the 4 virtues of sword fighting as told by an Italian sword master. So it's part and parcel of the game itself. So your first section, that red section after the orange, is the tutorial rules, which means you can play a couple of figures aside and learn the rules very quickly that way. Then we get into the cards themselves. Like I say, you're going to have a nation deck that is both your list building, your points value, as well as a reference to what the equipment, arms and armor that you're actually fielding. So the cards come in a variety of flavors like intrigue, honor, logistics, and veteran cards. And then we have playing the game. So this is the meat and potatoes of it. It's an action and reaction system. However, the actions are varying based on your unit that you bring in. They can activate multiple times as long as you have the command and control to activate them, and that's done by the virtues. And when you have virtues for a capo, the officer in charge, they're spent, and the type of virtue that you spend on an action will possibly give you benefits or impediments, depending whether you critically succeed or critically fail. So a 6 is a critical success and will give you a buff, and a 1 is a critical failure and will give you a debuff. And so, for example, and this is a really nice way of demonstrating it here. Prudence, speed, audacity, and fortitude are your 4 virtues. If I wanted to move, so I was in a position to attack, and I used audacity, if you succeed at the end of the capo's move, any enemy capo within 6 inches must roll a d6 for unburnt virtue, and on any 1, they burn virtue. We'll get to that in a moment. But if you fail, you move directly towards the nearest enemy unit. So if you want to close and actually attack somebody, be audacious, take the fight to them. Even if you fail your roll, you'll still move towards them. And the movement is sort of between 4 and 6 inches, randomized, depending on whether you roll low or high. So if you want to move quickly and move towards an objective or an enemy, then red is the way to go. However, if you'd chosen to go with fortitude, and then because maybe you only had fortitude left and you fail, you only move 1 inch. or prudence, you move directly away from the nearest enemy if you fail. So the virtues you have to spend and where you spend them become part and parcel of the game. And it's not just movement. These carry across into all facets of the game. So if I bring in one of the quick reference sheets, it's two-sided. On one side you have your virtues, on the other side you have your rules summary. So if we just look here, you've got movement, melee and shooting, and then each one has got its own table essentially for your critical failures and critical successes. And this I love because it means both as part of the list building and your strategic play, you need to be very aware of what you have available and how you plan on using it. So if you want to go for a very melee heavy, fast moving, hard hitting force, you might want to push a lot into speed and audacity when you're bringing your capo. If you want a more balanced setup, so you want to be able to do a bit of everything, you might want to spread these a bit more, because ranged, rallying, movement, fighting, all of these will have different benefits, pros and cons, depending on where they come in. If I bring in our decks of cards, I can explain how that works a bit better. So, okay, so if I bring in the Conditori, these are your mercenaries from Renaissance Italy. And if we're playing a game, we may play a 10-card game. And by that I mean you build your list using these cards. So you've got things like intrigues. Here you can play at any time to look at any hidden cards in your opponent's hand. So there's a bit of deck building in this, because some of these cards can be played from your hand to hinder your opponent or help yourself. But then there's also logistics cards, which is where you get your men and equipment on the tabletop from. There's veterancy cards that are upgrades. There are weapons that are upgrades, also as logistics. Your Milanese plate brings your armor save to a 1+, which is good because obviously people modify stuff. And a 1 is always a critical failure, but you're just giving yourself a bit of redundancy there for when you're hit by something big and broad. So if I was to go to the back of this, where I've pulled out some cards already. So for my 10-card game, first off, a capo is going to go in there. So he's our leader. And as a breakdown of the cards, faith is how many virtue can be spent on the card in a turn. Actions is how many actions they can take. So he can have 4 faith, or 4 of these virtues could be spent on him to perform up to 3 actions. So that could be a 1 for a movement, a 1 for a movement, and then 2 for attack, and that would be my 4 spent. Or it could be 2 for movement and 2 for attack, and that would be my 4 spent. So in one case I'm getting 2 moves and an attack, that's 3 actions. In the other I'm getting just 2 actions, but they're still both using all of my my faith, all of my virtue. Your to hit is a simple d6, 3 or more, although obviously modified by various things like cover in the game. It's also used for punching people. The armor is your armor save, and then the wound roll is if you fail an armor save, do they take a wound? And down here you can see they're armed with a arming sword, which has a reach of 0, but defense dice succeed on a 5 or 6 for crits, or a mace, which has a reach 0, but heavy armor save is reduced by +1. So if he was hitting himself, that armor of 2+ would go to a 3+. And then at the bottom we have the amount of models per card. So a capo, your officer, just the 1. Now to him, you can add bits and pieces. So you could add a virtue card, which would give him a fortitude, a prudence, and an audacity, which is essentially the command and control for the game. And these are spent every turn and then replenished at the end of the turn. But they can also be burnt. And when you burn them, they're not automatically replaced. They need to be rallied back, which is an action. They can also be burnt by people critically hitting you, or by poison, or some other cards, intrigue cards within the game. And if all of your virtue is ever burnt, then your capo will unfortunately take to the hills at the end of the turn. They just panic. This is like a morale. They've decided they're not going to win this, and so they must away. And there are different types of these virtue cards. So, like I say, you can look for the one that has maybe a broad spectrum of virtues, or one that pushes heavily into a specific type when you're building your deck. But they're also nation specific. So nations commanders that were famous for being very aggressive may find that they have a lot more audacity virtues when they come to list building than fortitude or prudence. Or nations that were known to be very defensively minded with their soldiers will have it so that the decks themselves tailor your force to being more historically accurate to the period. Then I could also add in something like this, where I can, the Pursuit of Princes, I can attach it to a capo before deployment, and once per round you can choose a fight activation, and in that the dice roll are 5s and 6s for crits. So he all of a sudden becomes a much better fighter, especially if you maybe tailor it with his weapon, or give him a new weapon that increases that again, or whatever it happens to be. But so far, that's 3 of my 10 cards just on my officer. So you'd want some troops in there as well. So in this case, I would grab some mercenaries. In this case, they have either pikes or halberds, and they have their own special rules for those. You get 3 models per card. So if I wanted 3 pike, I would have 1 card. If I wanted 3 halberds and 3 pikes, I'd have to get 2 of these cards. Maybe a bit of skirmishing as well. So another 3 model unit, and they can have shield and spear, shield and sword, or light crossbow if you want a bit of range. And now I'm halfway done with my list building. That's 5 of my 10 cards, but maybe I want these mercenaries to be veterans. So these veterans will actually gain speed and prudence, so they get virtues of their own to spend for combat or movement, which is great. And then I also want to give them a poleaxe to increase the enemy's armor save by +2, which means I'm much more likely to actually do them damage. So all of a sudden I've got a hard-hitting melee unit there. And then I decide to back them up with maybe heavy crossbows instead of my light crossbows for my skirmishers. And now my army is almost complete for my particular scenario. And to that, I just want to add a couple of upgrades to the capo. So first off, send them with a standard. Now the standard increases the capo's command range to 6 inches, and he has his own stat line. But I could also have chosen a musician, which increases the command range to a mighty 9 inches, but only affects a specific virtue, which allows a bit of modelling there. So if you've got a flute, then your fortitude is increased, or so your prudence is increased. Drummer's fortitude, horns audacity, and bagpipe is speed, because if anybody hears the bagpipes, they want to get moving quickly. So you can see there, you could have one or t'other Obviously, a slightly shorter range, but does all of it. A much greater range. And it's important because if people are outside of that capo's range, then they start to sort of lose faith in what's happening and float away from the battlefield. But building your force is as simple as picking the requisite number of cards, and that is why you can sort of keep list balancing relatively quick and easy. You're not having to worry about points, percentages, or anything else. The cards will tell you whether or not your opponent gets to see it, if it's attached to a unit, if it lasts the whole game, or if it's something that you use as an interrupt. And then when you come to play a campaign, like maybe the Rise of the Borgias, you would still be playing with your 10 cards or your 12 cards or whatever it happens to be, but you would have access to some new forces, whether it's intrigue cards that you can play to allow you to ambush your opponent with hidden deployment, or new capos to bring in for specific things. So bringing a professor or an artist either for their virtue, although he's got a command of 0, so he can only use his virtues on himself, or for specific scenarios. So you know you're going to go in to do something that requires construction or repair rolls. So you bring the artist with you to get that +3 bonus on your dice for that. So you're never having to deal with a lot of bookkeeping because everything's on the cards. So you just have your cards set to one side and use them that way. So those are very nice components. They're a standard card size, and the backs of them are all nicely color-coded, illustrated, and numbered as well. So you can see what deck belongs to what, especially if you're playing a campaign game and maybe you've got a card from the scenario deck, and maybe you've got a card from, this actually contains 2 decks, Fires of Faith and Dogs of War. So maybe you've taken the Dogs of War cards from here, and then just being able to go, well, this is Rise of the Borgias and it's card 32. So you can discover where your cards are and get them back into the relevant decks easily and quickly. It also means when you're playing, if you're playing a campaign game, you can just slip your current campaign force into your little envelope and go, well, there's my mercenaries are currently in there. And it means you're not having to go digging every time between games as well. So that's how the decks of cards feature in the game. Like I say, there's a little bit of list building in there. So going back to the rules then, you have the main game is set down or set up as per these rules. But at the end there are some optional rules. So you don't have to play with these, but there's some interesting changes to the game if you choose to do so. So terrain types become a lot more relevant, and when playing a skirmish game on a small table, a 2x2, having the granularity of terrain affecting movement is really interesting, especially when you've got people like lightly armed skirmishers attempting to get round behind heavily armoured mercenaries. Attacks of opportunity are in here as well. There are even rules for movement based on armour rather than the standard movement. So the lighter the armour, the faster your men can move. So light unarmoured skirmishers are much faster than heavy armoured mercenaries in demi-plate or whatever it happens to be, which makes a lot of sense. There's some explanation about the warbands construction and the nation decks, and also what they're like as an actual faction to play, which is handy to have. And then at the end you have scenario generation. So the scenarios themselves, there's a few different types of setup. You can use these or maybe play something that is either historically accurate or design your own scenarios in and around them. So you've got a bit of options in there alongside the objective types. So you can see here the objectives can have different operations required to complete them. So bringing your artist to decode a manuscript may be slightly better than bringing, an uneducated martial capo. But if you can't get there, if you don't have the soldiers and the nuance to actually get to the objective, then bringing the right man for the right job may not have been worth your while. You have to try and divvy it up. But you've got a nice scenario generator with your objective types, your deployments, the objects and purposes therein, and then your campaign play, so you can build your companies over time and mix the various cards in there. It's a interesting setup for a system that really leans into the historical background and theme of the period, but that's coupled with a really robust and interesting skirmish system. So when you are moving and fighting, you have to choose the right activations. You have to choose your virtues. And if you're going to engage in a combat, maybe you won't have enough actions to move into combat and fight this turn. But if you move into contact and you think your opponent might fight, you use the dice that you activated with. So even if you can't fight this turn, you may push a load of audacity into that melee, which gives you the option, the opportunity to have your crit rolls, where they'll have to burn virtues. And like I say, virtues will cause panic. Panic will remove officers. Officers not being on the table will remove soldiers practically straight away. If there's nobody within command range, then they wonder why they're there by themselves. And it's just a simple melee roll and then comparison. So if I hit on a 3+, my opponent then defends, and he's just looking to exceed my dice roll. If I pull a few of these out. So if I'd gone in and fought with speed and audacity, and my opponent defended with fortitude and prudence, you would first off in a fight, unbeknownst to your opponent, pick the breakdown of these weapons, breakdown of these dice. So I could put both into attack, both into defense, one into each. And my opponent would do the same with his dice, and it could be, he might be looking at 3 dice and go, well, he's going to go all 3 attack. I'm going to go 1 defense and 1 attack. And then you roll to see how they go. So my attack would say 6, amazing. My opponent would have to roll to see if he loses a virtue on his capo. His attacks back would be 2 critical failures and a hit. And then my defensive dice, I just need to get a 3 or more. So I would actually cancel his hit out, and he would have to deal with a critical failure for fortitude. So my opponent would actually, the opponent capo would rally a virtue. And then here we have, you must move this model 2 inches away from your opponents. So they run in, they fight poorly, it inspires my men and I get a virtue back. They potentially lose a virtue. No, they don't in this case. And then they retreat slightly back from the combat itself, which then could provoke an attack of opportunity if you're playing with those rules. So the combat system is very straightforward. And then afterwards you do your armor saves and your wounds as well. But it's a really, really tight, intricate little skirmish system that has a great set of bones on it that can expand beyond the realms of Italy in the 15th century. War of the Roses obviously nailed on for that. Pushing into Elizabethan England would make a lot of sense as well. Spain You've got your Habsburgs are always kicking off with people. So it's really just a case of the list design, or finding a deck of cards that more or less does what you think that faction currently do anyway, and just sort of, renaming them. So if you think the British might, or sorry, English at this stage, would fight more like the Swiss or the French or whatever it happens to be, then just use that deck of cards to go with it. But component-wise, all very nice. Unfortunately, my tin did get kicked to death by my postman, but even then it still survived. The book itself has got a satin finish, and like I say, spiral bound, so it should be fairly wipe clean and easy to use at the table without breaking it. The little virtue tokens are a nice gloss finish, so fairly robust, and a nice weight to them as well, not too thin. And then the card decks themselves, standard card decks, you could sleeve them if you want to, but they will do the job lovely as is. So you can pick up Force of Virtue from everything from the full bundle down to the PDF rules. So you just need to get tokens and dice of your own, and they don't need to be these special tokens and dice. You can just use any beads you have, which means you can get into the game very quickly. The only thing you kind of need is the decks of cards. So that is probably the only physical thing you need to buy. And then you could PDF that and then replace the dice and tokens with dice and tokens of your own. But hopefully that gives you a good insight into the medieval skirmishes from Masterstroke. All right, folks, there we go. A big box full of fun. Really fascinating game. I really enjoy it. I think if you're interested in really tight narrative, small-scale skirmish for this period, then this is a fantastic game, because there's a lot of decisions that you're constantly having to make. List building is a deck of cards. Can you count how many cards you need? Then you can build a list. It's that simple, and very easily balanced as well. And with the addition of campaigns and siege rules and cavalry and possibly even some feudal Irish against Elizabethan English coming as well, I've been told. The sky's the limit. It's a fantastic set that they've put together with a real historical richness baked into the actual style of gameplay. And yeah, I really think this is one that people should check out. Let me know what you think below. I'm going to move on. Bye-bye.
Go ahead and check out our other content on screen now. And while you're at it, why not hit subscribe and remember to ding our dong. Go on, you know you want to click it. Go on.